and gentlemen. My name is Robert Nash, and I'm the president of the Winnipeg branch of the Canadian International Council. Welcome to our event, which is coming to you live from Winnipeg, Manitoba, where we sit on Treaty 1 territory, the homeland of the Cree, Anishinaabe, and Dakota peoples, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. This is our first event of our speakers program for 2021-2022. Between now and June next year, we are looking forward very much to offering a mix of in-person and online events as conditions allow. While it will be so nice to meet people face-to-face once again, the Zoom genie will never be put back in the bottle. Local events offer us the opportunity to highlight local talent and expertise. Online events offer us the opportunity to present experts from afar and to give local experts a wider audience. Hybrid events might just offer us the best of both options. If this is your first time joining us, welcome. We hope that what we have to offer this evening. And if you've been with us before, thank you for your patronage and your support. We look forward to seeing those of you who live in Winnipeg in person this year, and please consider supporting us by joining the CIC. This evening, we have two speakers, Dr. James Fergusson and Zobair Deen. They will speak about the recent withdrawal of American forces from Afghanistan and the implications that changes in Afghanistan over the summer may have on Canadian foreign policy. Dr. Jim is a longtime friend of the Winnipeg branch, and he is a respected and trusted voice on foreign policy issues. Dr. Jim is the Deputy Director of the Center for Defense and Security Studies at the University of Winnipeg, Manitoba. Zobair is from Winnipeg and served as a political analyst and strategic advisor for the Nato Isaf mission in Afghanistan from 2004 to 2014, and conducted research on violent extremism in Afghanistan in 2009 up to 2019. Dr. Jim and Zobair will speak for approximately 20 minutes each, after which we will have a moderated question and answer session. Please add your questions to the Q&A tool at any time, and this event will end no later than 8:30 this evening. So without further ado, I invite Zobair to share his thoughts with us.
Well, good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to be a part of the tonight's event. As Robert mentioned, my name is Zobair Deen, and I'm an Afghan Canadian. I moved to Canada as a refugee in '98. And since 2004, I've been part of a mission in Afghanistan. So I'd like to address some of the dynamics at play in Canada's relationship to the Taliban. And I'd like to explore this topic together with you in the limited time that we have together online. By way of background, Afghanistan has been caught in the middle of regional and global conflicts. You all probably remember, or perhaps have read about the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in '79. It was followed by the Soviet troops withdrawal from Afghanistan in '88. And during this period from 1979 to 1988, the West and other countries supported a group of freedom fighters known as the Mujahideen. Subsequently, the Mujahideen took over the power in '92, and Afghanistan plunged into a civil war and factional warfare from '92 to '96. In '96, a small group of religious or individual from madrasas emerged. They called themselves the Taliban, and the Taliban eventually took the power in '96 and ruled Afghanistan until 2001. As soon as the Taliban took over Afghanistan, Afghanistan became a breeding ground to foreign international terrorist groups such as Al-Qaeda, Islamic Movement of Uzbekistan, Lashkar-e-Taiba, and the list just goes on. And the Taliban, in the period that they were in power, they were involved in acts of domestic terrorism, violations of human rights, but they also provided the safe haven to the international terrorist groups in Afghanistan, and also provided them with the logistical support. In this period, Canada and other Western nations had a limited or non-existent involvement in Afghanistan. Then 9/11 happened. We all are aware of our recent history. 20 years ago, 9/11 happened, and that changed the world. Post 9/11, Canada considered the Taliban a terrorist entity, and Canada joined the US-led coalition force in Afghanistan, known as the Operation Enduring Freedom, in fighting the Taliban and the elements of Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. While they were successful in toppling the Taliban regime back in late 2001, majority of the Taliban leaders and the Al-Qaeda leaders successfully relocated to Pakistan and maintained their presence there, and they were protected by elements of the Pakistani security services for the past 20 years. And after many years, Canada ended its military mission in Afghanistan in 2014. The Canadian diplomatic presence in Afghanistan up until now provided us with an oversight of Canadian aid money in Afghanistan. Canada continued advancing the shared values of human rights, peace, and security, and also our diplomatic presence in Afghanistan allowed Canada to monitor serious security threats to Canadian national security and also against Canadian interests abroad. Moving to present, Canada does not currently have a diplomatic presence in Afghanistan, just like many of our allies. We all had to leave in a rush in August of this year in 2021. And with this abrupt end to our presence there, we no longer have eyes and ears on the ground, leaving our country, Canada, more vulnerable to possible Al-Qaeda and also ISIS attacks. Our ability to collect intelligence on the Canadian foreign fighters in Afghanistan has ended. While Canada, as a strong G7 nation, has access to sophisticated electronic surveillance systems, our ability to collect human intelligence has ended. Now, some of us may be wondering, who are the new Taliban? Well, the 2.0 version of the Taliban that we are currently seeing in power, they're no different than the 1.0 version of the Taliban in 1990s. The Taliban back in 1990s did not allow women to be part of the society, part of the government. They banned women from going to school. Well, in 2021, the 2.0 version of the Taliban are no different than the 1.0 version of the Taliban. Back in 1990s, the Taliban provided the safe haven and protected the elements of Al-Qaeda, and then they allowed Afghanistan to be a breeding ground for foreign terrorist groups. Well, in 2021, very recently published United Nations Security Council alleges that the Taliban have been affiliated with 20 known terrorist organizations. And not to mention now that 17 out of the recently 33 government appointees by the Taliban or the cabinet ministers are either on the FBI's most wanted list or they are on the UN's blacklist. Now, the idea of a toned down moderate Taliban willing to work with the West and respecting the human rights and not allowing Afghanistan to become a breeding ground to foreign terrorists, again, is simply not true. Now, the Taliban have transitioned from being an insurgent group to controlling the government of Afghanistan, making promises not to allow the Afghan soil to be used by ISIS-K, by the Al-Qaeda and other terrorist organizations against the West. The previously Taliban-affiliated groups such as the ISIS-K have watched the Taliban's advances and now they're feeling betrayed and alienated. The previously cooperative relationships between these two groups have ended. That's why that we have been seeing some bomb explosions in the Kabul city and in other provinces in Taliban-controlled, Taliban-dominated areas. And there will be, and then in the weeks to come, or perhaps in the months to come, there will be significant numbers of Taliban that may be defecting to groups of terrorists such as ISIS-K. Some may ask why. Well, the rank and file Taliban who were trained as suicide bombers, who were radicalized in the past 20 years, they were told that jihad, in the essence, is beyond the borders of Afghanistan. Once we take over Afghanistan, we're going to move to Central Asia. We will be moving to Iran. We'll be moving to the West. Now those Taliban are feeling betrayed. The reason they're feeling betrayed is because recently the Taliban government announced that they're going to be aligning their strategies and with the Chinese government. So betrayal comes because the Uyghurs are part of the Taliban. Uyghurs from China, from Northeast China, have been part of the Al-Qaeda, have been part of the ISIS-K, and also been part of the Taliban. The Uyghurs fought or have been trying to fight for their rights in China, but also been asking for greater autonomy. So groups like Uyghurs and the Taliban who are affiliated with Uyghurs feeling betrayed. So as Canadians, we need to be aware that ISIS-K and Al-Qaeda-backed Taliban are now no longer affiliated as before. So until August of 2021, the Taliban was busy fighting for control of Afghanistan. ISIS-K and the Al-Qaeda and other related groups were occupied with establishing physical space for themselves in Afghanistan. Now that daily effort and fight has ended. The Taliban and any groups they provided safe haven for can turn their attention to furthering their global jihadist aims and consolidating their power. With no US military boots on the ground, the terrorist organizations are no longer prevented from pursuing their aims of global jihad. So the coming to power of the Taliban in Afghanistan means that the regional balance is changing. Afghanistan has huge regional and global significance, and of course is positioned among the Russia, China on one side, Pakistan, India a little bit further up, and Iran. We will see similarities to Syria. As a matter of fact, for ISIS-K or the Al-Qaeda to work towards establishing themselves in the mountains of Afghanistan, it will give them far more logistical and strategic advantages than establishing themselves in the deserts of Syria or Iraq. These groups who have safe havens in Afghanistan will have no mercy on their Western targets. Suddenly, Canada seems much more within their reach, and ISIS-K and the Al-Qaeda will have a home address for their ideologies. This is again the courtesy of the Taliban. Having an established homeland gives legitimacy to their cause, and nonviolent sympathizers around the world celebrate their success. And to homegrown extremists in Canada or elsewhere, having a homeland is much more attractive and compelling than a web address where they get radicalized. They want to be physically present there. So if we don't have any preventative measures in place over the next 12 to 24 months, perhaps a number of Canadians who've been radicalized and who've been to the extremist ideologies will move to the mountains of Afghanistan, will move to the mountains of Pakistan, will eventually vanish in the mountains and become part of this global jihad aim. So Canada's foreign policy must firstly take into account that Afghanistan is now not only home to the Taliban, but also to a host of other terrorist organizations capable of increasing in strength and extending their reach beyond the borders of Afghanistan. Our foreign policy must take a comprehensive and multifaceted approach to dealing with not only the Taliban, but other organizations that are present in Afghanistan that violently oppose our country and our values. An important dynamic to be aware of is that the other terrorist organizations, for example, ISIS-K, do not have the same relationship with the Pakistani government or with the Pakistani security elements like the Taliban have been having for the past 4 or 3 decades, pardon me. Unlike the Taliban, ISIS-K has an international reach and appeal. They have members from Islamic movement of Uzbekistan, from Turkestan Islamic Party that are essentially the Uyghurs from Northeast China, Sunni groups from Iran, Arabs from the Middle East, and various Western converts to Islam. And ISIS-K is not bound by any Taliban agreement with the US or with the West. And despite their previous affiliation with the Taliban, ISIS-K and the Al-Qaeda will not have a straightforward relationship with the Taliban. So on one hand, the Taliban may be saying, we want peace, we don't want our land to be used by any elements from the Al-Qaeda or the ISIS. But on the other hand, there are many and predictable issues there. So in the days to come and the weeks to come, the Taliban are going to be fighting in multiple fronts. First of all, they're going to be fighting against the resisting force that are in this Afghan-led. They'll be fighting against the presence of the ISIS-K. And currently there's this huge split within the Taliban leadership. There's the Haqqani network that are representing the East, but also the Mullah Brother faction that is representing the southern Afghanistan. So in the months ahead, Canada and Western allies will have a choice to support the Al-Qaeda-led Taliban group, or the Al-Qaeda-backed Taliban group against ISIS in the presence of the ISIS-K, or perhaps support a resistance force against the presence of the Al-Qaeda and the ISIS-K who are not Taliban affiliates, or perhaps join a group of Western nations that would be carrying out unilateral drone strikes against the Taliban and pardon me, against the Al-Qaeda and the ISIS-K elements in Afghanistan. Secondly, the Canada's foreign policy must take into account the hands that fit the Taliban by putting sanctions on Pakistan or hold Pakistan to account. Something they failed to do over the past 20 years of this proxy war that we all experienced while we were in Afghanistan. We must take a much more decisive approach to Pakistan or any other country that supports the Taliban and thereby ISIS or other organizations that violently oppose Canada or Canadian values or our allies. And of course, while we are thinking of sanctions against the Taliban, we must clearly have a distinction between the Afghan people who are in need of basic food items, or perhaps against or the Taliban leadership, who are currently on the United Nations blacklists, or perhaps on the FBI list. The aid money that's going to be going to Afghanistan must be monitored by the United Nations because we don't want to support the Taliban infrastructure. Furthermore, Canada needs to carefully watch what response Pakistan will have to groups like ISIS-K. Apparently they're emerging right now. They are going to be, they recently have even announced that they're going to be having their own shadow governors in Afghanistan. So it was it was somewhat of a Taliban practice in the past 20 years to have shadow governors. So we are going to be watching, we should be watching these developments very, very carefully. Would ISIS-K be used in a proxy war against Pakistan's foes, India? Are they going to be using them against Iran? Are they going to be controlling Central Asia and so on and so forth? So in light of these three entities, one of the most important question for the Canadian government is how to collect human intelligence in Afghanistan to protect our national security and how to ensure that all the gains, including women's rights that have been made in Afghanistan since 2001 are preserved. In the past, Canada and our NATO allies were concerned with the Taliban in Afghanistan and the Al-Qaeda's local presence. Now Canada must be concerned with not only the Taliban and the Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan, but also ISIS-K and other terrorist entities pursuing global jihad from Afghanistan. In the past, foreign policy in Afghanistan that failed to acknowledge and sanction a major player like Pakistan led to the takeover of Afghanistan by Al-Qaeda-backed Taliban. Now in the present, the stakes have been raised. Now in the present, a weak foreign policy in Afghanistan would lead to global turmoil. Thank you everyone for listening. I'm looking forward to your questions and interacting with you. Over to you, Dr. Fergusson.
Great, thanks, Zobair. It's certainly a pleasure to be invited, and let me congratulate the organizers of the Winnipeg branch of the Council for all the great work they've done over the past several years. And it's certainly a pleasure to speak to you about the implications of the fall. I'll use the term fall of Afghanistan for Canada and the West, and maybe the world as a whole. Zobair gave you sort of, if I don't want to put words in his mouth, sort of the 1,000-foot level look. I'm going to give you the 20,000-foot level look at Afghanistan and its place in Canadian foreign policy. And as you'll quickly find out, Zobair and I have significant differences of opinion here. So let me go to the point of the session. What are the implications of Afghanistan, of the fall of Afghanistan for Canada and the West? The answer is by and large 0 to none. There will be those who lament the loss of Canadian lives during the combat phase of Canada's involvement in Afghanistan, that they were wasted lives. There'll be those that lament the massive amount of resources Canada and our allies, the United States and the Europeans, pumped into Afghanistan to win, I put it more bluntly, to buy the hearts and minds of the Afghan people, which failed. The nation building exercise that failed entirely. And we should have not be surprised with that for a variety of reasons. Maybe we can get into in the question and answer. As Zobair points out, some will point to the question of future terrorist activities emanating out of Afghanistan as a major concern, but they're not. The world has changed. I would agree entirely with Zobair 15 years ago. Today, it's a different world. Some would, of course, point out to the humanitarian disaster underway in Afghanistan, the need for food, employment, the refugee issue. Those are all there. But again, they sit roughly on the margins. And from the 20,000 feet or 30,000 feet perspective that I have, let me put this in two contexts. And Zobair might be right that we should be paying attention to Afghanistan, but we won't. And I'll do this from two different perspectives. One from Afghanistan in the geostrategic and political world, and the second, the place of Afghanistan in Canadian foreign policy. From the geostrategic, geopolitical world, Afghanistan is simply irrelevant. It's marginal. It has always been marginal. You can trace it back to the mid and late 19th century, where use Kipling's term of the Great Game over Afghanistan between the Russians and the British in India, which ended up Afghanistan being an isolated and basically ignored buffer state between the two. After the Great Game ended, related to the rapprochement between Moscow and London in the lead up to World War I, Afghanistan simply disappeared from the radar scene. World War I, World War II, the Cold War, whoever talked about Afghanistan? Whoever even looked at Afghanistan? Pakistan, yes. India, that was importance. Iran, China, all these buffer areas. But Afghanistan was an isolated, ignored buffer. And no one was interested in dealing with the Afghans. This, of course, all changed, as Zobair pointed out, in 1978 with the communist coup, the overthrow of the king first and the communist coup, and then the interventions of the Russians. And now we paid attention to Afghanistan. As soon as the Russians left in 1988, we stopped paying attention to Afghanistan. It disappeared once again from the strategic political map. We ended up being wrong because of the events that would eventually produce 9/11, but nonetheless, we ignored it. 9/11 brought attention back to Afghanistan again, the American Operation Enduring Freedom, Canada, NATO's involvement, and others' involvement in the role. But look at Canada from this perspective. Once we withdrew from the combat mission in 2011, even during the years afterwards, we were involved in the training mission. After 2011, Afghanistan disappeared again. We weren't really interested. It popped back, of course, in the events with the American withdrawal. We had already left. Most of the NATO allies, for all intents and purposes, had left. It popped back. There was an issue in front of everyone about refugees, about the Afghans who supported the Allied forces, particularly in the case of Canada, supported Canadians in Afghanistan. That was a major issue. But at the end of the day, it had no bearing whatsoever on anything in Canada. I would point your attention to the recent federal election, the lead up. The opposition parties tried to embarrass the government about Afghanistan and their approach to dealing with refugees and the Canadian airlift exercise meant nothing. So what of Afghanistan today? What is its geopolitical and strategic importance? Actually, it's gone back to where it was for a long time. Actually, none. It's a buffer state. If you think about people who have been talking about China's involvement with the Taliban, the agreement they apparently have, which is really apparently agreement for Chinese aid in return for the Taliban not supporting the Uyghurs, how that will play out, because the Taliban control no more than the previous government controlled in terms of all the factions. And it's important to remember, in my view, that Afghanistan is a nation state, is a state in name. The ability of any central government to control the factions, the ethnic groups in Afghanistan is very limited. It's always been very limited. Anytime they try to, like we tried, failed miserably. So how that will work out, we don't know. They talk about China to Pakistan to Afghanistan, then to Tehran and Iran as part of this great Chinese expansion, encircling India, penetrating to the west, the One Belt, One Road. Well, if you look at what China's really up to, Afghanistan has nothing to do with the One Belt and One Road initiative. It runs north of Afghanistan through Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, and Tajikistan, pardon me, and south through Pakistan to the west, and how that will play out. I mean, we have to remember in all this, Afghanistan is not a geographic friendly country. It's a, I wouldn't want to say, no, it's not a wasteland, but it's very arid. It sits on the Himalayas. Winter seasons are horrible, and it's in an earthquake zone. So what I would suggest to you, when the powers, and we're living in a world today of the great powers, the relation between the United States, China on one hand, the United States, China, and Russia on the other hand, with India also involved. Pakistan, from all the perspectives, I think when you look at that, is simply going to be left alone to be a buffer. No one wants to engage in Afghanistan. The Russians certainly don't want. The Americans don't want to go back unless, if Zobair is right, and this I think is the lesson that may have been learned by the Taliban, if he is correct that they're going to be the home of terrorists who are going to try to export terrorism, they have to know that the answer is going to be, they're going to have another visit from the Americans and others. The Chinese know. I'm sure they have integrated these lessons. So from a geopolitical strategic perspective, Afghanistan would simply disappear from our map. And within 6 months, I would predict, if you look at the past patterns, we're not going to be talking about Afghanistan at all. To paraphrase from the 1938 in the British press over the issue of Czechoslovakia and the Nazi demands on Czechoslovakia, one of the big phrases that came out at the time was, where is Czechoslovakia and why should we care? Well, we're going back to the world of where is Afghanistan and why should we care? So that's the first point I would say. The second point is you look at this in the context of Canadian foreign policy. I guess one of the important questions we have to ask ourselves is, what exactly is Canadian foreign policy today? Normally, governments historically come in and do, along with a defense policy review, a foreign policy review, and issue a white paper to put a stamp to communicate both to its own bureaucrats, to the Canadian public, and to others. This is the principles and the preferences, norms, and beliefs, etc., of Canadian foreign policy. Well, we've had none. The last paper written by the government was by Paul Martin in 2005. The Harper government didn't do it. The Trudeau government didn't do it. So what is our foreign policy towards places, as Zobair points out, like Afghanistan? Well, the simple answer is, I don't know. Let's be nice. Let's respond to humanitarian demands, although we can't, for political reasons, as we all know, do this officially unless the Taliban behave according to Western values. Western values failed. Let's remember this. Western values, the imposition through Western policy during the period of Western involvement led by the United States in Afghanistan failed, period. And they're not going to succeed in the future because it's a different political culture with a different history. So when you ask yourself, what is our foreign policy going to be in Afghanistan? It's going to be, we'll say nice things. We may channel aid. We'll try to deal with the refugee issue if it emerges, but we're not sending any more planes to Afghanistan, by the way. That's out. We'll deal, and we have to, with the refugee issue. We'll allow private charities and the UN to funnel food aid into Afghanistan. But that's the end of the story. Because if you look at the behavior of Canadian governments, and not just this government, but previous governments, our foreign policy amounts to one simple thing: economics, trade. So if you ask yourself, where does Afghanistan potentially sit in that equation? They sit nowhere. They're irrelevant. We have no interest there. And the same is the case if you even go further around the area into the Middle East, for example, even further. Don't believe the rhetoric of the Canadian government, of this one or previous ones. We talk cheap, but we don't pay, because that's not where our government lies, and it doesn't reflect the domestic politics, for good or ill, of Canada. I think we have to recognize one thing, and this is where, strangely enough, Canada lines up with, I think, Afghanistan. I think the Afghans, and Zobair knows more about this than I do, but my intuitive impression is the Afghan people, the various ethnic groups and the problems, internal problems they have, are by and large isolationists. They want to be left alone. The Canadian public is by and large isolationist, except for the rhetoric of the government. We want to be left alone, and we're happy to be left alone. We will go where we have to, relative to our economic interests and our broader protectors, if you will, the United States and our allies. And we will line up with them, as we always do. And I'm not trying to argue to you that we're subservient to them. All I'm trying to argue is that our national interests line up with theirs, and that's why we go with them. But at the end of the day, we're not going to go very far anymore. I would suggest the Canadian government, and again, we're in a different environment now, is going to be very reluctant to engage. We may have lost, and Zobair is right, I agree with him, we have lost human intelligence assets in the region. That's okay. We never had really many, and we relied upon the Americans, as we always rely upon the Americans. And that's not a bad thing. That's a good thing for us. Canadian foreign policy, its defense and security policy, is defined by doing it on the cheap, because there's no benefits to doing it any other way in this country. Now, we might lament this, as Zobair argues, and I do disagree with him, but nonetheless he argues, if we are wrong about the situation in Afghanistan, if we are wrong that the Taliban, in fact, will become willingly the home of terrorists seeking to export jihad, I don't believe that. I think they've learned a lesson, or maybe they should have learned a lesson. And they have the Russians to concern about, and the Chinese and others to concern about in all this equation. But if we're wrong, this will be responded to, and it may cost us something. But at the end of the day, are we going to actually do anything? Are we going to invest? Are we going to pay attention? The simple answer is Canada, NATO. NATO is now interested in one thing: Russia, period. The United States is obsessed with China. Their basic interests in the region of what used to be Northwest Asia, we used to call it, is all a function of how they interpret the Chinese actions and the Chinese response and the response of others. And from their perspective, one of the silver linings, and there's always a silver lining to a failure like Afghanistan. The silver lining is it puts, in fact, Russia and the Chinese on a greater collision course, because the Chinese will be penetrating into areas of which the Russians consider their sphere of influence. And that ends up in the cold-blooded calculations at the political level as a good thing. So it's not a cheery story I have to tell you if you're an Afghan, if you have links to Afghanistan. It's not a cheery story, but it's not a unique story for us. You can go back over time, and the number of places we've invested and gone to. Think of Somalia in the 1990s. That disappeared. These all disappear because they are not of vital strategic, political, and for Canada, economic interests to us. And when necessary, the government will say what they like to say. You know, we are a good global citizen. And that, as I like to say, and I think it's $3 now, gets us on the bus in Winnipeg. So there you have my view on the implications of Afghanistan and its fall for the West and Canada. So I'll turn it over to the moderator for questions.
All right, thank you guys so much for speaking. I found that very enlightening, and I think we have a few questions here to keep the conversation going. So we'll just get right on top of those. So for the first one, it's to both of you, and that is, what effect might the treatment of those Afghanis who supported the NATO ISAF mission have on the willingness of other foreign nationals to welcome and support Western militaries should they deploy in their country? So either one of you could take a stab at that one first.
I think from my perspective, that trust is lost. Had it been on if 38 million people had a choice to leave that country, they would have left the country simply because Afghans are changed people. You know, I slightly disagree with Dr. Fergusson. I think the last 20 years of presence of the NATO military forces in Afghanistan have changed the dynamics there significantly. And kids that were when they're 5 years old, they're 25. The 10-year-olds are 30. Most of the young people are educated. So again, coming back to your question, I think the NATO allies, they've lost their respect, I think, in the region. Our Kurdish allies were abandoned, left in the hands of ISIS in the Middle East, and Afghans experienced similar situation. Not entirely, it wasn't entirely the fault of NATO. Of course, there were corruption. I think corruption was a cancer in that society, and it just ate up the whole society and resulted in the return of the Taliban to power.
Well, just one brief comment. It's unfortunate that Zobair keeps going first and I go last. So next time I got to go first because it's fair. Just on a side point, if Afghan culture really changed as a function of Western involvement and their attempt to win the hearts and minds, we haven't seen the evidence of it in the context of the collapse of the government and the success of the Taliban. What he's telling me, if I interpret that correctly, is that what he's telling me is that the Taliban rule will eventually, and I wouldn't be surprised if this occurs, because I don't think the civil war is really over yet, that they will incur increasing difficulties trying to impose their will outside of the major cities they control. As to the question of what impact does this have in terms of those who worked with ISAF in the United States in a variety of different roles, the answer, I think, is twofold. One is you have to ask the question, why is it they worked with them? They had the skills, it was employment, it was money, it helped their families, all out of self-interest. Understandable. And I'm not being critical or pejorative about those motives. They're completely understandable. And if that's the case that drove it, and I don't know the answer to this, but if that's the case, then in future similar type situations, when we talk about potential intervention in the context of great power rivalries in other parts of Asia or in Africa that are likely to emerge, the Afghan experience is going to have no impact as well. Those same motives will affect everyone else in terms of their willingness. And of course, they'll be also informed by their education and their values and beliefs, where they want to line up. The second answer to that question is, we've heard this before. We heard this in the context of the American withdrawal from Vietnam and that fiasco, which we've seen the photos of, the helicopters pulling people out from the roofs of Saigon in 1975. Zobair mentioned the Kurds. There's no shortage of examples. Yeah, we've been there, done that before, abandoned people before. We'll do it again under whatever political circumstances drive all this and the environment, etc. Will it have an impact down the road of being able to enlist locals, the indigenous people, to provide support to intervening forces, whether in terms of those forces directly involved in the conflict from outside, like Canadians or Americans or NATO forces or what have you, or in terms of supporting the government, which is backed by foreign forces? The answer to me is zero impact. And besides, they won't even know. How will they know? We're not going to advertise this to everyone, are we? So that's what I consider about this.
Great, thank you. So I'm just going to keep going with the questions, and in the spirit of fairness, we'll let you go first, Dr. Fergusson.
Okay.
So the question here is, if state building can no longer be central to foreign policy for Canada and its allies, then what replaces this fundamental that's been the center of decades of international interventions?
That's a really interesting question. I don't know, on one hand, if state building has ever been central to our policies. It's been a fallout of the function of the various military reasons for intervention, largely because of what I would call the fundamental foundations of Western liberal Canada, US, what have you, not as much the Europeans, but certainly us, moralistic and universalistic values which drive us. The simple answer is don't do this. If there's a strategic reason and political reason that you need to deal with a weak state for whatever strategic reasons, go in, deal with them, and leave. But we can't. And then we stumble through these state building exercises, which are doomed to failure, largely because, as we all know, and it's not a great surprise, we built a liberal democratic culture in North America, in the West, in centuries. You're not going to be able to transform a culture which has no traditions in the matter of a decade. So that I think we have to be concerned about. We get entrapped in this. We trap ourselves. It's what I like to call a self-inflicted wound. And I mean, it's all for good intentions, and I'm not trying to criticize us, but from a strategic perspective, it's extremely problematic. We are bound by what we believe, and we end up behaving that way. The second point is, I don't think we're going to be going into this type of world anymore. In the world of the great power rivalries that we've seen return, certainly struggles on the periphery will be increasingly important. But they're not going to take the fashion of this moralistic nation-building element. It will be much more pragmatic, realpolitik. And I'm always taken back, and I know this is not a positive thing to say, and it upsets us nice liberals, and I don't want to give everyone the feeling that I'm callous and bloodthirsty, you know, that type of person, because I'm not. I have all the values you have. It's just I look at the world. You may recall back a long time ago, Henry Kissinger, during his days in senior office in the US administration under Nixon and Ford, was once asked asked in a press conference, why is it, according to American values, does the United States support brutal dictators? Kissinger's response was, yes, basically, we support brutal dictators, but there are brutal dictators. And that changes that environment we're moving into right now, changes that state building. The rhetoric will still be there because we can't avoid it, but it's a different strategic world. So that's the way I think about the state building. If we're going to do state building, my answer is simple. Don't do it. Walk away from it. Zobair.
Hi, Dr. Fergusson. Thank you for your comments. Thank you. I don't have anything further to say about the state building topic, but I'd like to just briefly mention that ISIS issue and Al-Qaeda issue is a global issue. It's not an Afghan tribal issue that Canada spent its resources on. And most certainly that was not the case. I think Canada poured resources in fighting a global, global jihadist group or a global terrorist group. So the earlier comment, I think I just wanted to mention this, that the issue of terrorism is not a local problem and it's not a local matter. It shouldn't be the responsibility of one nation or the other nation to fight. So in my opinion, in the future, I think Canada will play a role, or will have to play a role, because we don't live in an era of 2 decades ago, where getting messages across terrorists getting to our homeland would be much of a problem. Radicalized Canadians fighting on the ground in Afghanistan or in Pakistan, or have disappeared or vanished in the region, are matters, or should be matters of concern to Canada. So how are we gonna, my question to you is, how are we gonna, in what role, in what capacity are we gonna be addressing that issue? Are we gonna just say we're gonna be concerned about Winnipeg, Manitoba and Steinbach vaccination? Or are we gonna be involved in some capacity globally to address these issues? And how are we gonna be addressing those issues if boots on the ground is not going to be an option for the Canadian government or part of the Canadian foreign policy, Dr. Fergusson?
Should I answer?
Please.
Well, I think you're right to be concerned. And I guess I would put your comments in the perspective is that we should not lose sight of this problem. Sadly, however, I fear we will lose sight of it, and it'll drift down to the agenda. Now, I think we have to remember that as a function of 9/11 and all the security measures put in place, Canada, in cooperation with Canada, in the Five Eyes with the United States, in the Five Eyes with NATO, we have at least we think and believe we have a very robust intelligence network domestically, in particular, to deal with these problems. We're much better at doing things and dealing with the problems of the social media, et cetera, that you pointed out. That raises, of course, the danger, and I think you're right about this, Zobair, the danger of being complacent. We've done this. We know what they're going to do. We can figure them out. We'll have to wait until they surprise us again. And it's hard to imagine how they would. But of course, we couldn't imagine 9/11 either. So it is a problem. It's a danger. But if you look in the list of things, of priorities for Canada, for the United States, terrorism and these issues you're talking about have dropped lower and lower. Fewer and fewer resources are going to be devoted because bigger things are taking the agenda. Should they? That's open for political discussion and debate. But I'm just suggesting you that's where they're going to be. The second hand is, and I certainly can't speak to the terrorist organizations, their mindsets, how they think. But if you look since 2001, the track record of the terrorist organizations, where we emphasize in the media their successes, when we look at the end of the day, they failed. They've continually failed. They've lost. Now, you may be right, they've recovered because of Afghanistan. That may be important. But otherwise, they've lost everywhere they've gone. And
Why?
you sort of wonder, and I can't answer this for the leadership, if they wonder, maybe it's a good idea that when we're undertaking terrorist actions, that certain things we don't want to repeat again, because they don't work for us. If you think of the West as a sleeping dog, let the dog sleep and deal with the locals. Now, will that be the outcome? I don't know. But I think at the end of the day, as I mentioned, Zobair, your concerns are well placed. I agree with them. I would hope the Canadian government, the security officials in Canada and elsewhere are paying much more attention. I fear that they aren't, and they won't, because the world, in their views, has shifted. And that's always a problem. And then we get surprised.
Thank you, Dr. Fergusson.
Awesome. I really like the discussion format you guys have embraced. It's making it really easy to moderate. So just to keep that ball rolling, we got a few more questions. And in the meantime, if anybody in attendance wants to send a question to the Q&A tool, feel free to continue doing that. So from Kausar, in your opinion, and this is for both of you, why did it take 20 years to learn or relearn the lessons of the past in Afghanistan? Why did it take so long to learn lessons that should have already been learned? I would reframe that question.
You want to go, Zobair?
Sure, Dr. Fergusson. Thank you for letting me go first on this. I think widely, I would say, I know that Canada was committed to staying in Afghanistan as part of the NATO alliance, but from what I remember and from what I recall, we lacked a long-term strategy. Our mandate was extended every 6 months to a year. So our NATO military planners would come together, and then we will present our fact-finding to the politicians, and our mission would get extended for another 6 months to a year. So as a result, we did not have a long-term vision. We did not have a long-term goal. In Afghanistan, we just end up going there as part of a military alliance, and we end up staying there. Dr. Fergusson earlier mentioned about the self-inflicted wounds. Yeah, we did a number of those self-inflicted wounds, and but fortunately, unlike many countries, we pulled out of that mission earlier on instead of staying until 2021. So that lack of strategy, that lack of awareness played a major role, I think, inside. At one point, when the world got busy with the invasion of Iraq by the U.S.-led alliance, Afghanistan was forgotten. And towards the end of the mission in Afghanistan, Americans didn't know why they were there in the first place. Are they there for nation building? Are they dying for Afghan women's rights? Are they dying for building schools in remote areas? They had lost that vision, they had lost track of why we're there in the first place. That's sort of my answer to your question, Dr. Kausar.
Before I answer that, someone may have a question. I saw it sort of pop up in my screen about a question about 6-month increments. The 6-month decision-making increments are a function of the 6-month rotation of troops. That's why they do this in 6 months, because your troops are there for 6 months, then you rotate them in and out. So that's the time frame the political forces work upon, informed by military forces. Zobair is dead right. What was our strategy? What was our objective? If you go back to the ill-fated American mission after the UN failed miserably in Somalia in the early 90s, and the United States stepped in, and they failed as well, and then would pull out, leaving it, sort of dropping it back in the hands of the UN to little success. The great critique that particularly came out of the military was, when you go into these operations, what we need to know is, what is your exit strategy? How are we going to get out? And when we went into Afghanistan, there was sort of, the first endpoint was to overthrow the government, seize Al-Qaeda, establish a new government. And that sort of was, once we've done that, we're out. Well, we didn't go out. The objective changed, as Zobair clearly pointed out. We had no strategic objective. We didn't know what it was. to build a nation, a democratic nation, a stable nation? Did we care about what type of government as long as it wasn't a government to support terrorism? No one knew. The government didn't know. So that's the problem. Once you get in, how do you get out? And it's not new. Somalia was a case for the United States where they just walked away with little repercussions at least for the American government. Lots of repercussions with Somalis. The Vietnam example is the United States got involved in Vietnam, and again, they couldn't figure out how to get out. And eventually they found a way out, or what Nixon called peace with honor, which didn't really work out very well for them. This is always a problem because governments change their focus and attention as the world changes and environment changes for them. Should we have left long ago? Probably. Could we? No. At least decision makers didn't think they could walk away. And I would just add one last thing about this. When Trump started to negotiate this exit with the Taliban, he was widely criticized. Of course, Trump was criticized for everything he did, for good or ill, he was criticized. Biden inherited it and did exactly the same thing. And of course, attitudes changed in the United States. As for Canada, we just simply lost interest in it.
Great. So I heard from both of you kind of along the same lines of a similar theme of kind of losing track and shifting focuses. So this next question kind of follows in line with that. And it's from Zainab. So she asks, since Afghanistan citizens are fighting with different groups under similar goals, at the citizen level or at the people's level, what ideas can be instilled or roles can be played by Canada for efforts there by the Afghani people to be successful without leading to destruction and war and loss of life and property?
Well, my simple answer is none. That's all yakking. If we're going to have any impact to trying to steer the Taliban or deal with and change that environment, there's only one thing that Canada can do, which is what we won't do. Arm them. Provide military support and quiet advice and money for them to fight the fight they have to fight. Because this is not a liberal democratic society where they're going to walk, and Zobair, correct me if I'm wrong, where they're going to protest in the streets and it's going to force the government to change its mind. Not in Afghanistan. It doesn't work that way. So that's not a nice answer, but that's the only one I can think of that's realistic.
I think they have been protesting on the streets. We've had tens of thousands of people that protested a major event, a major economical development that took place in their provinces. That was about 3 years ago, approximately 3 to 4 years ago, that resulted in Daesh taking advantage of the situation and causing mass casualty in that protest. And in the last month and a half since the Taliban came to power, it's Afghan women that have been protesting, not so much Afghan men, but these Western educated women. They're fighting for their rights. They are fighting for their place in that society. So we do have a very interesting approach, like the Afghanistan from the past. In my opinion, I believe that the Afghans have changed, not westernized necessarily. They're still holding on to the traditional values of their forefathers, the history, the religion, and so on and so forth. But they're much more aware compared to 20 years ago. And I think the reason for Canada to be involved in a society like Afghanistan in the future, if Canada decides to go that route, is because we value human rights. We are the leader in human rights. We are the leader, one of the G7 countries, and shared values would be security. Security is important. And again, to your earlier comment of the the inflicting wounds on ourselves, we don't want to go that deep. But what are some of the incentives, Dr. Fergusson, in your opinion, if we were to be involved in a country like Afghanistan or Northern Kurdistan or wherever, what are some of the incentives that we can offer to the locals without getting too involved in the tribal warfares? Like, what are some of the things, in your opinion, Dr. Fergusson?
I'm not an expert in this area, but my answer is fairly straightforward. From 2001, when the Americans intervened, and then we followed with them, and the Allies followed, to 2021, we gave the Afghan people no shortage of incentives. We spent, the collective spent probably billions of dollars invested in building infrastructure, Canada particularly in rebuilding the dam, the irrigation system in the Kandahar region. I can't remember exactly where it was. And the results, marginal at best. It's very difficult in my mind, in my view, for a country like Canada, and it's not just Canada, the West, to be able to provide incentives, economic incentives, because I think that's what we end up talking about, economic incentives, without dragging along with us those Western liberal values, which are fundamentally alien to the cultures we're going to. How do you translate that in those incentive package, whatever it is, and however you think of it, into a delivery system which is suitable and fits the culture where it's going to? And that's not just been a problem in Afghanistan, it's been the age-old problem of Western aid, period, over the past many decades in delivering aid, because part of our aid is always tied to our own interests. You can't ignore that. So I'm just not sanguine about it. We'll do it. Don't get me wrong, Zobair. We'll go down this path in a variety of ways. The second element I would answer to this, and it relates to your point, where I do agree with you. I wish you were dead right. I don't know what we can do. And I do agree there are large segments, I'm sure, in the Afghan population that cut across ethnic and tribal lines, which have learned, have been educated and socialized with at least some element of basic Western values about human rights. And I understand, and I know about, not to a great degree, but know about the protests from women. How successful they're going to be, I am dubious about. But what are we going to do? The current position of the United States, Canada, and the West is, until you demonstrate clearly, as far as I understand, until you demonstrate clearly that you're going to respect human rights and women's rights, then we're going to cut you off from all aid. We're going to cut you off from economic development funds. We're going to squeeze you that way. We haven't got the backbone to do that, because as I listened to yesterday on CBC radio, the food program, the World Food Program, people are starving. We will fold up our tent pretty quick. And this then hinges strategically, in my view, in terms of what will the Russians do? And the Russians don't have a lot of funds to do much, except sell guns. And what will the Chinese really do in terms of delivering that aid? Because that's the option for the Afghan government. Either we modify our behavior to get vital Western aid if they think they need it. I'm not convinced they think that way, but I don't know. Or we can substitute it with Chinese aid with no strings attached, but there's always strings attached. So no government, in my view, is in an easy position to be able to sort this out on what to do. And countries like Canada, because of our past record and rhetoric, is probably one of the weakest to be able to say, if you don't do this, then you're not going to get this from us. We just don't have the backbone for it. It would require leadership. And I hate to criticize my own country. One of the days they're going to take away my Canadian citizenship. We got no leadership with backbone in this country.
All right. That's a good period stamp at the end of that sentence. So we have another question here, and it's kind of going back to the theme of past lessons learned. So now, what new lessons can Canada and the West learn from the Afghan experience in circumstances where intervention was welcomed in the cities, where schools and infrastructure were built and derided in the provinces, and where drone strikes delivered more death and destruction than development?
Well, you go to first, Zobair?
Oh, so you go ahead. I'm gonna think a little bit about the question.
What makes you think we were welcomed rather than imposed our will? I mean,
The
I don't
question,
recall-
the wording of the question.
Okay, the wording of the question. Okay, let me go to the wording of the question then. I don't recall when the American forces arrived and then quickly moved in support of the Northern Alliance, that they were met in town after town by massive waves of civilians waving, "Hooray, we've been freed." I don't remember that. And I would also recall to everyone that the American forces, when they entered Baghdad, were met with waving people saying, "Oh, Hussein is gone." How well did that turn out for them? So I don't know the answer to this question. I think it's a false dichotomy. And a lot of it depends upon things which I only know on the periphery about Afghan culture, about the nature of the use of force and violence in Afghan culture, and how it relates to the relationship between winning the hearts and minds and drone strikes. And remember, a lot of the drone strikes that occurred particularly which it escalated with the Obama administration, didn't occur in Afghanistan. They were targeted in Pakistan, where the leadership of the Taliban and Al-Qaeda, where they could target them. They make great news. All this made great news in the Western press. But I'm not convinced that it had much relevance to the average Afghan in the world they lived in. And again, Zobair knows more about Afghan culture than I do, and the extent to which these types of things were really abnormal in traditional Afghan culture. I don't know. But generally, I mean, again, this is a Western image from Western information, from Western journalists, from Western interpreters, from people like Rudyard Kipling about the Afghans, that they are a violent people. They don't take outsiders well. And the use of force is not an alien thing as it is in the West as a function of their culture. Now, I may be dead wrong about this. I probably have read the wrong literature about this, but you get that image. So I think Zobair is probably in a better position to answer this question than I am, but I don't think the two really relate to one another at all.
All right. From my opinion and my experience and being part of that society, I watched the Russian invasion, and how people responded. They were imposed force. Why they were imposed force? They rolled down with their tanks across the border from back then Soviet Union, Termis, from Tajikistan and so on and so forth. They rolled into Afghanistan. Sure, yeah, Americans did the same thing, but they imposed their ideology, which really ticked people off. With that ideology, there was back in 1970s, there's a war of ideology emerging in Kabul University, in Afghan society. It was post-monarchy. So our great, King Zahir Shah was living in exile in 72. His cousin had taken over the country, and he declared a republic and the end of the monarchy back in 72. So what emerged out of the Russian invasion was a pure Afghan-led resistance against the first ideological beliefs. That was the communism. That was contrary to Islamic beliefs and traditional beliefs of Afghans. And then secondly, Afghans did not like their guns. they love their guns. They don't like their uniforms. Afghans' favorite gun is the Kalashnikov and 303 Enfield rifles back in early 1900. So just to do a quick comparison here, the Americans post 9/11 or 2001, or the invasion of Afghanistan by the Americans, it brought a sigh of relief to imams who were preaching under the Taliban. They had to grow their beards long enough, and if the beards were not long enough, even though you're an imam, you've been present. It brought relief to women of Afghanistan. It brought relief to many, many different ethnic groups, not just one particular group, including Pashtuns. So the past 20 years of war is imposed war, like from the Taliban side, on Afghan people. The Taliban were not welcome. As I mentioned earlier, the 38 million people, if they had a choice to hang on a plane, they will fly out of there. They leave the country. So there was a clear distinction that Afghans did not fight against the NATO forces in Afghanistan. The group of people that fought against Afghanistan, their leaders did not live in Afghanistan. They lived in a place like Pakistan, in Peshawar and Quetta, in Karachi, in the Sindh, in province of Sindh. Their forces will cross into Afghanistan, and half the time our Canadian forces will chase these groups of insurgents that would cross from Pakistan into Afghanistan, chase them back into the Pakistani territory, and they'll be called on to stop going into Pakistani territories. So despite the collateral damage that the NATO forces did in Afghanistan, despite all the mistakes, they were welcome in Afghanistan. So the groups of people essentially that fought them, they were against the Afghan values to begin with. They're not a traditionalist cowboy, cowboys from the countryside who have taken over the country right now. They are essentially a insurgent group that were fed and nurtured and protected by the Pakistani ISI, to be very, very specific. So this is not a global jihad. And if this was, not an Afghan-led jihad against the NATO forces, if Afghans had the same mentality, if they had picked up arms like the way they did against the Soviet invasion, I don't think we would have survived 20 years. I don't think so. Despite having the drones, the lack of strategy, as a matter of fact, the fact that we were all short-term thinkers, we're unaware of the situation. We all carried a small booklet of, Afghan culture and 5 pages, no awareness. We're from here, they're from over there. Russia was a lot closer to Afghanistan, so they were much more culturally aware, although they're Eastern Europeans, but in their mindsets, they're very Asian. They knew all the dynamics. They survived 9 years. NATO forces survived 20 years. They could have continued there for another 100 years because some of the bases, the contract for some of the bases was for 100 years by the US. Bagram was a prime example of that. NATO Isaf headquarters was an example of that. And Afghans did not necessarily push the Americans to leave. They left because of their own issues domestically. So anyways, I just wanted to mention this. Thank you, Dr. Fergusson, and everyone for listening.
Yeah, that was great. You guys have really done a good job kind of discussing and providing contrast for a lot of these topics. So we've discussed a lot about the Afghan people and their impact on international actors. So to get a little more specific and take it away from the people side of things and go more towards resources as a strategic objective, the question here is, Afghanistan has natural resources that other countries such as China and its other neighbors will surely covet. What implications might competition for those resources have for Canadian interests and then also Western interests in general? And either of you can go first on that one.
Well, I always find it interesting that when you have these conflicts and Western intervention related to them, it never takes very long till people talk about resources. Usually it's oil. I think back to the Falkland Islands conflict, and it was really all about oil. And that was 40 years ago now. And where's the oil? Well, it's nowhere to be found. Thanks a lot for that. I asked the question, and I've heard, and I'm not an expert. I haven't followed the question of Afghan resources. It's a mountainous area. You would assume they would have a fair amount of mineral resources that could be exploited. Their quality and their relative cost-effective access relative to the world market, relative to Chinese requirements. I don't have the answer to that. Zobair may know better than I do about the resources, and over the years, every now and then, this always pops out that the Chinese or someone's after the resources, but it never goes anywhere. So to be honest, I'm dubious. To go back to the old movie, show me the money, show me the resources. Let's see someone invest. Because of course we live in a global marketplace. It depends what the global market looks like relative to the resources they may have. And I don't think mining is an easy thing in Afghanistan, not least of all because it's in a fault zone. You're going to invest a lot of money, which is very dangerous. And I point out to you, I think it was yesterday, there was a earthquake in Afghanistan again, in Pakistan again. So Zobair may know better than me, but I'm dubious of that argument.
Thank you, Dr. Fergusson. Afghanistan is very rich when it comes to natural resources. Chinese have been investing in the copper mines in Afghanistan, and successfully, partly because the Taliban were attacking the Chinese companies, and they were involved in one point in the attempted kidnapping of the Chinese engineers. So the Chinese were essentially paying the elected government of Afghanistan, and also they were trying to make deals with the Taliban. And for China, it's a much more convenient Taliban, or a much more convenient partner and ally, and they don't really care about the human rights violations or anything like that. They are a much reliable partner than the previously elected government. Because previously elected government, they tried to spare resources, they tried to spare the military, controlling towns and providing security. But again, at the end of the day, if there was a bomb explosion or a mine explosion of some sort, or a small arms attack, that will shake up, the confidence of the investors. So essentially, the Chinese would be after the natural resources. I mean, geographically, they're sharing 50 kilometers of border with Afghanistan and Northeast, and they would be a much more reliable partner than bringing an American from Texas or someone from Ottawa to invest, who have no knowledge of the culture, and geographically they're far away. They want to know what to do with that money, with the natural resource of Afghanistan. Secondly, I think the other thing that would be flourishing under the Taliban would be opium business. So I know that that's on natural resources, but there will be countries and there will be international mafia that will be covering the opium market. I mean, for the past 20 years, elements of Taliban, they worked with organized crime groups to support their insurgency in Afghanistan. So essentially, they provided escorts, convoy escorts of these drug convoys leaving for Iran, and then from Iran to Turkey, and Turkey to Europe, and eventually the drugs would make it to places like Canada or elsewhere in the West. So that would be a very attractive market, and I'm going to be curious to see which international mafia would be, which of the groups would be more interested. And under the current circumstance, and the fact that Taliban have taken control of Afghanistan, who and where and how they're going to be partnering with the elements of Taliban and getting their hands on the opium business and market. Thank you.
Good point. I stand corrected.
Awesome. Thank you both for the great discussion. I think you guys have left everybody in attendance with plenty to think about with regards to Afghanistan. Barring any final comments, I'm going to pass it over to our branch vice president, Brad Fergusson, for some closing remarks. So thank you again to the speakers and to all in attendance.
Great. Thank you very much, Jason. And it's my pleasure to thank Professor Fergusson and Zobair for speaking to our audience tonight. Professor Fergusson has been a longtime trusted contact of the CIC. You've addressed us on a number of issues over the years, and we always appreciate your experience and insights on the geopolitical issues of the day. And we always appreciate the clear-eyed view that you bring to the issues. And Zobair, appreciate your personal and professional experience in Afghanistan. You've brought a lot of really rich detail to our understanding of the country and the factors that have affected its development, over the years. So, and I really like to thank you both for your answers and for your discussion between yourselves. It was useful for us as an audience to explore some of the issues a little further. And I think you helped us in the one of the things we wanted to do with the program was to kind of address some of the questions Canadians have about how it came to this. We know about the millions, billions of dollars that have been invested in the country, the number of Canadian lives that were lost in Afghanistan trying to not just defeat the Taliban, but to improve the quality of life for the Afghan people. And it just seemed that after 20 years, we don't have a lot to show for our efforts. So we appreciate your insights in explaining the situation to us and giving us an idea of what to expect in the future. So in appreciation for Zobair Deen and Professor Fergusson's presentations tonight, the CIC will make a contribution of $50 to a charity of their choice in lieu of an honorarium. And I look forward to more exciting CIC events coming up in the next few months. We don't have anything on the schedule right now, but I encourage you to either follow us on Facebook or Twitter or sign up for our email feed so you hear about the exciting events we have coming up in the next few months. So thanks everyone for joining us. Thanks again to our expert speakers tonight, and we look forward to seeing everyone again soon. Have a good night.
Good night. Thank you.
Good night. Thank you.
Thank you.
And thanks, Zobair. It was great.
Thank you, Dr. Ferguson. Nice meeting you.
Yeah,
I hope to
look
be in
forward to
touch with
seeing you
you.
again.
Thank you.